car, railroad car. It's not really known who got them in there because none of these guys were club members of the Jekyll Island Club, and somebody had to reserve the space for them. It was probably J.P. Morgan who was a member of the Jekyll Island Club. And these other guys weren't big-shotty enough to be members. So Senator Aldrich was there. Henry Davison, the Morgan partner, was there, I've already mentioned. Paul Warburg, the Kuhn-Lower partner, was there. Frank Vanderlip, vice president of Rockefeller's National City Bank. Charles Norton, who was president of Morgan's First National Bank in New York. And A. Pine Andrew, who was the economist. He was the Harvard economist. You have to have some technician to work out the specifics, who was staff assistant to Aldrich. And this, again, this symbolizes the unity of business, government, and economics, or economists. Okay, so it's a living embodiment, as I say, of the Rockefeller, Kuhn-Loeb, Morgan interests allied in this great struggle, aided by economic technicians. Okay, they draft the bill for the central bank. They draft what was later to become the Federal Reserve Act, almost word for word, except for tiny details. The draft was essentially written by Warburg with a decentralized soupçon added from others. The final writing, the actual writing, was contributed by Vanderlip. And as I say, the main disagreement was Aldrich wanted a straight central bank, and Warburg said, no, we have to have a phony facade of decentralization. Okay, and then Aldrich finally, they make the agreement. Aldrich presents the draft to the National Monetary Commission in January 1911. And slightly revised, it was introduced as a commission report or a commission bill, as the Aldrich bill, a year later, and then, which in turn became the Federal Final Reserve Act. Okay, now, the interesting thing is that Aldrich and the Monetary Commission, they were ready for the report by January 1911, as I said. They delayed it for a whole year. Why did they delay it? Because by this time, in the elections of 1910, the Democrats won the Congress. And so, at this point, they realized they had to do some more spade work. They had to convert the Democrats, and they also had to convert the rest of the public. They couldn't just drive the thing through. So we needed a year of propaganda and agitation before they actually presented the Federal Reserve bill. So at the beginning of February 1911, this educational campaign starts. 22 top bankers from 12 cities meet in Atlantic City to consider the Aldrich plan. They warmly endorse it, of course, and as James Forgan, who was president of the First National Bank of Chicago, which was Rockefeller-controlled, as he put it, the real purpose of this conference was to discuss winning the banking community over to government control directed by the bankers for their own ends. I'm going to repeat that. The real purpose of this conference is to discuss winning the banking community over to government control directed by the bankers for their own ends. Okay. Educating the bankers. This is not the kind of government intervention you don't like, fellas. This is it. This is good stuff. It was generally appreciated by the conference. This would increase the power of the big national banks to compete with the rapidly growing state banks, privately, with state chartered private banks, help bring the state banks under control, and strengthen the position of the national banks in foreign banking activities. Okay, by November 1911, Aldrich, combined with the big bankers, won the support of the American Bankers Association, the big trade association of bankers. And Aldrich addresses the association in a speech, and he says, the organization proposed is not a bank, but a cooperative union of all the banks of the country for definite purposes. For the lay public, Aldrich and his colleagues created an organization in the spring of 1911 called the National Citizens League for the Creation of a Sound Banking System. The League grew out of a resolution which Paul Warburg had pushed through a meeting of the National Board of Trade in January 1910, setting aside January 18th of 1911 to be Monetary Day, devoted to a, quote, businessmen's monetary conference. At that January 1911 meeting, the conference appointed a committee of 7, headed by Warburg, to organize the Businessman's Monetary Reform League. A group of leading Chicago businessmen were then organized, and the idea was they should establish the Citizens League not in New York, which is suspect, but in Chicago, the heartland of America. So it looks like a grassrootsy organization. And J. Lawrence Lachlan, the economist who was the operating head of it, admitted that later, later years. Yeah, this whole thing was a banker's front, which he, of course, was in favor of. So the stated purpose of the League, for example, is to advance the cause of, quote, cooperation with dominant centralization of all banks by an evolution out of our clearinghouse experience. And then there was various splits, and there were personality conflicts in the League and so forth and so on, which are really unimportant. And historians, unfortunately, tend to focus on these minor issues of Clause 7 versus Clause 8 and all that sort of nonsense. At any rate, the key is that much of the conflict centered around the fact that the Democrats, and Laughlin, who was a Democrat, wanted to get rid of the evil name Aldrich, because Aldrich was a big-shot Republican, from the bill. And so what finally happened, since the Democrats ran Congress at the time, it became the Glass bill instead of the Aldrich bill. That was the big fight. It took a couple of years to work that out. At any rate, all the big bankers were in favor of it. They didn't really care about the name on the bill. That's a matter of personal prestige, or that sort of stuff. At the annual meeting of the American Bankers Association in August 1913, A. Barton Hepburn of the Chase National Bank exulted about a successful effort to get the bankers to endorse the Glass bill. Quote, "The measure recognizes and adopts the principles of a central bank. Indeed, if it works out as the sponsors of the law hope, it will make all incorporated banks together joint owners of a central dominating power." Okay, so the Federal Reserve System was then enacted in December 1913 and opened its doors the following November, November 14. And one at the same time a cartelizing and inflationary organization. Okay, the bank structure was such that the banks themselves were very powerful in selecting Federal Reserve officials. There's a whole different structure, different regional structure and all that. The chief executive officer of each bank, which those days was called the governor and now called the president, was selected by the bank directors themselves. In other words, the regional bank directors were mostly bankers. And then we have, of course, the Federal Reserve Board and the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which those days ran the system until 1929. The next step is to analyze who these guys were, and this, of course, becomes important. Another thing that happened, by the way, is the reserves was centralized in the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve banks become the monopolists of all paper money, not just national banks, but now only the Federal Reserve can print paper money. And the reserve requirements were cut in half, thereby lending a great inflationary potential to the whole system. Reserve requirements before that were about 20%, and now go down to about 10%. The bankers all hail the enactment of the Federal Reserve System. This is great stuff. And now they said we have to see who's going to run it. Now, the next step is who the personnel are. Okay, there were 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board in that period, of whom 2 were ex officio in those days, the Secretary of Treasury and the control of the currency. So who are they? Well, Secretary of Treasury and control of the currency before they assumed their posts. Again, who are they before they became big shots in the Wilson administration? They were close associates, business and financial associates themselves. Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo, had been a failing businessman in New York City. He was a loser. He set up several enterprises in his life, and they all collapsed. For some reason, he was befriended. He was taken a personal liking to by J.P. Morgan, which is something you want to have happen to you in that period. And Morgan decided to bail McAdoo out. And he set McAdoo up as president of New York's Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, which ran the tubes under the Hudson River, which he was before he became Secretary of Treasury. He spent his entire life, the rest of his life, in the Morgan financial ambit. His fellow board members and officers of the Hudson Manhattan Transit were all Morgan people. There were president of Morgan companies. There were presidents of Morgan cartel, Morgan merged companies in industry like International Harvester and U.S. Steel, which were originally, by the way, monopoly. It was supposed to be monopolies of the steel industry and the agricultural machinery industry. It didn't work. The whole thing was a flopperoo from that perspective. So all these guys were on his board, and then when after he becomes Secretary of the Treasury, McAdoo cements his political stature by marrying the daughter of President Wilson, which is the second best thing for you to do if you're Wilson's president. One is you become a pal of Morgan, and 2, you become the son-in-law of Wilson. The controller of the currency was a longtime associate of McAdoo's. He was a Virginia banker, president of the Richmond Trust Safe Deposit Company, John Skelton Williams, had been a director of McAdoo's Hudson Manhattan Railroad and president of the Morgan-oriented Seaboard Airline Railway. Okay, so that's those 2 guys. Who are the other 5 appointees? Who are the other 5 people whom Wilson appointed to the Federal Reserve Board? Well, it was Charles Hamlin, who was another close associate of McAdoo. He was a Boston attorney who had married into the wealthy Prine family of Albany, a family long connected with the New York Central Railroad, which had been run by the Morgans for about 4 decades by this point. The other 4 appointees were Paul Warburg, we've already talked about, Frederick Delano was the uncle of